because otherwise we cannot but lose, because inevitably modern science, being very strong, having this reality, undeniable reality, it's hard. You get with your head against this reality, is going to win.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to a special edition of The Anadromist. I'm Burn Power, coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, on a fine early spring day in March. And there's a calm between, I think it's lunchtime for the workers who are working on these massive apartment buildings next to me, and they're using a jackhammer, and it's really loud and annoying. So I'm trying to get this done before it starts again. But if it starts again, we'll just keep going. So today, what are we doing? We are going to listen to a lecture which I have annotated with illustrations, and it is a lecture called What is Reality by Hans Rookmaaker, and this was given in 1976. And this is a very important lecture to me, and I'll explain why in a moment. But first, who is Hans Rookmaaker? Well, he was a Dutch art historian, a Dutch Christian art historian, born in 1922. He was converted to the Dutch Reformed Protestant version of Christianity while he was in a prisoner of war camp in World War II in Ukraine, where he had met a Christian philosopher, Johan Mekkes. After the war, Rookmaaker noticed a lack of engagement in the arts by most Christians in the West. And so he decided to do something about it. He would eventually become the professor of art history at the Free University of Amsterdam. In 1948, he met Francis Schaeffer, who shared a similar outlook to his. And Francis and Edith Schaeffer would go on later to create the L'Abri Fellowship in the small village of Huémoz in the Alps in Switzerland. Later, Rookmaaker, along with his wife Anky, would help to start the Dutch L'Abri in the Netherlands. Now, Rookmaaker would go around to universities and colleges and seminaries and discuss art and why Christians should have some sort of connection to the arts. Now, he was the mortal enemy of any sort of propaganda disguised as art. He felt Christians should really pay attention to what was going on in the cultural realm. He was also an avid music lover and gave lectures not only on art, but on music and other cultural subjects as well. And wherever he went, he seemed to stir up both deep thought amongst his listeners and controversy. He would often say things that were almost deliberately provocative. I actually love listening to the tapes of his lectures because he will just say the most unexpected things, particularly if you're like me. American, I had become a Christian in 1970 through the Jesus People, but he would just say things to pop the bubble of what you were, the typical Christian thought. Now, the lecture, What is Reality, is for me the summation of the last period of his life. He died, unfortunately, in 1977, in March of 1977. I never had a chance to meet him, which is one of the regrets of my life. I ended up going to L'Abri in October of 1978, and my thought was, if only he could have waited. But I discovered his tapes there. And this lecture, What is Reality, is probably something I've listened to since 1978 at least 40 times. I lost count somewhere, but it's a lot. Why? Because I always got something out of it. This is his kind of final summation of how the Western world lost its sense of meaning. And it has to do with how we see the world. And he talks about different viewpoints of what reality is and how our reality has actually changed because our thoughts have changed. The text of this lecture, by the way, can be found in the complete works of Hans Rookmaaker, which was edited by his daughter and a friend of mine, Marleen Hengelaar Rookmaaker. And it's pricey now to buy. I think even the paperback editions are pricey. I bought them when they first came out, and it set me back a few dollars, but I have never regretted a moment of that because now I have all of his... he wrote a book, Modern Art and the Death of a Culture, and there were a couple of other shorter books of his that came out after his death. There was also his thesis project, which was on Gauguin and symbolist art, which somehow I ended up getting interested in that as well. I can't begin to count the debt I owe to Rookmaaker as an influence on my own thoughts. I mean, you'll hear names here that you will hear in many of my videos and lectures: Owen Barfield, Jacques Ellul, Michael Polanyi, an emphasis on the Baroque era, and especially his digging through the more obscure and sometimes very disturbing aspects of history to bring to light what has been happening. This lecture is from 1976. The language used in it is different than the language we use today. His audience was largely Christians, Christian university students from evangelical backgrounds. But like I said, he would often poke the sacred cows of the evangelicals to get them to think. And in fact, I think if you look around at anyone from Protestant or evangelical background who's doing good art today in any field, I think if you scratch around in their influences, you're going to find Rookmaaker somewhere back there. Because prior to Rookmaaker, almost no one was doing anything of substance that wasn't propaganda. I mean, you did have, before them, you had people like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien doing art, and those are completely unrelated to Rookmaaker, except, of course, he had read those things. But there was a dearth of any real creative outpouring in the realm of evangelical Christian Protestant Reformed circles. I don't think Rookmaaker would have been at all surprised by the developments in postmodern culture and thought since his death in 1977. He was already starting to use the word postmodern at that point. And I can speak for certainty that, I listened very carefully to his lectures, and then I went to live in New York City, and I was never surprised by any developments that came along the pike because Rookmaaker was so thorough at investigating what had happened. Obviously, his language here will be slotted towards Christian, but I think if you're the kind of person who got something out of, say, the lectures of Jordan Peterson and have been wondering, where do we go from here? I think Rookmaaker is actually the advanced level. That is to say, Rookmaaker was working on these things so long ago. We talk about the meaning crisis. Some people who are younger, most likely, will talk about the meaning crisis as if it just developed. Whereas Rookmaaker has been looking at this. You'll see him say the meaning crisis started at the end of the 17th century. And he had already plumbed the depth of it by that point. So, this is why for me, I look to him as, the master. He's the guy who I looked at. I mean, there are other people I really respect. Obviously, C.S. Lewis, Solzhenitsyn, Dostoevsky, Tarkovsky. And interestingly enough, the Russians were not affected in the same way in the arts that the people in the West were. In the West, and he explains it, largely through the development of a stream of the Reformation called pietism. This undermined the Christian relationship to society as a whole by making God private. Anyway, we need to listen to the lecture, and I'll come back afterwards and just say a couple of more words, but I'd especially like to thank Marlene Hengelaar-Rookmaaker for her permission to use her father's lectures, and I will be presenting more Rookmaaker material down the line. And I'll have a special edition coming up in the not too distant future of kind of an overview of some of Rookmaaker's ideas in one video. And I'm especially excited to get to that. But I'd really like to thank her for also finding the one film that has Rookmaaker, just a few images of Rookmaaker in motion. And you'll see that I use a couple of clips from that here. And of course, she also passed on a few photos. It's interesting that today there are so many photos of people, so many movies of people. And yet, even as recently as the 1960s and 70s, there are very few visual records of people compared to what we're used to. So you just it's almost like these little mysteries of who these people were, which in a way I think is better than the overload we have of human faces and images today. And if you wish to listen to more lectures by Rookmaaker, there are plenty more, especially on the arts. I would recommend going to the L'Abri Ideas Library and typing in the word Rookmaaker and give them a look, and you can donate to them as well. So, but that link will be below here, so look for it if you're interested in more Rookmaaker, and you should be. So, without any further ado, Hans Rookmaaker.
This lecture, I know out of experience, is a very difficult lecture. It is very simple, really, but most simple things are difficult for people to understand who have learned to make everything that is simple into something that's difficult. So I'm going back to simplicity, and that's a real thing. Of course, I've been thinking all my life about cultural problems and the problematics of our culture. We talk about the crisis in our culture, the death of God, the death of man. As C.S. Lewis says, the abolition of man. We talk about the absurdity of man, the death of a culture. I use that term myself. And we want to build a new, instead of a neo-paganism or a neo-Gnosticism, of which I'm going to talk tomorrow morning, we want to have something else. We come to talk about a reformation. And as you remember, I said this morning, I feel that if there's anything to be put in the slogan, it is this, the requirement for weeping, praying, thinking, and doing in this sequence. And otherwise we never get anywhere. Now, in this part of thinking, I feel that this fits in. Unless we solve some of the very, very basic problems, we will never get anywhere. You are theologians, and of course you are fighting and thinking about modern theology, and of course you can have towards something like modern theology a very easy solution, and you say these people are wrong. They're stupid, they are unfaithful, and go on with all the kind of terms like that, without ever thinking about the problems that lie behind their stand. I think that they opted out as Christians too early, and I think that's their mistake. But I think that the problems that are behind it got to be solved if we ourselves will not be swept from our feet by modernism. Just the same. So I think it's very important to think through what is reality. I'm saying always to my little painter friends, please, please, there got to be more reality in your work, and reality is what we're aiming for. And I'm saying to the students that come to L'Abri, we got to be real people, and reality is what we're aiming for, and reality is related to mannishness or humanity, whatever you call it. Well, these are beautiful words, but we got to know what it means, and where are the problems. So this is what the lecture is really about, just to think what is reality. And we will see that it ends up with a question mark. I'm not saying that I have the solutions, but if I have done something in my life, then I feel a little bit proud. Of course, that's wrong, but we are all wrong, so I accept that. But I'm a little bit proud that I can give this lecture, because it's a result of 25 years of thinking of what is the question. So it's not the answer, but it's the question. And I think that before you have the questions, having the question is half the answer. Not to know how the question is, you never have an answer. So I think it's very important to think about these things. And of course, it can be added and it can be built upon. And I know it's difficult. I find it difficult, and I think that if you really understand me, you got to understand and find it difficult. So let's start now. What is reality? I would like to begin to discuss how my and maybe your great-grandfather, somebody's great-grandfather, around 1900 or in the late 19th century, how this person traveled in his vacation. It's a European story. The same might have happened in America. This person, he and his wife, took the train, went out to Basel, changed to a smaller train, went out of the train into another train, and then again to another little tram, and at the end were at a little station, and so they were arriving there at 4:53, and there was the hotelier, the man of the hotel. He was waiting for them for the pension, and he would say, very nice to see you again, and he took their luggage, and they walked not so far to the little pension, and they would say, oh yes, we know that dinner is at 6, we have just the time for making a nice little walk, and so we'll see you. And they made a little walk around. Now these people had been there at that particular place every year for their vacation for 23 years. Every year they went to the same place. And in making the little round, a road that they had walked every year 14 times at least, because they were for 2 weeks there. So they knew that, I don't know how many times they had gone that little road. They came back and they said to the hotelier, now we did our walk and it's a beautiful little walk and we love it, we know it, and we really love to be back again and see it again. But why was that big tree not there anymore? And then the man would say, well, I'm so sorry, but there's been a wind and so on and so on and so on. You see, but and this is the point that I want to make, just because these people took the trouble to be there every time again, they at a certain moment could weep because a tree wasn't there. They saw the hole in the universe that nobody else would see, who doesn't know. But they would be weeping because a certain tree was gone. Because he left a hole in the universe, something beautiful had gone. And, of course, if we go into reality, then reality, and that's what I want to say, is not something that's there. Reality is something that has to be conquered, to be discovered, to be opened up. It takes time. But if you do so, you get contact with that. And only so you can fall in love with something. And your love for a tree makes you weep when the tree is gone. So reality is not something that's there objectively. There's one word that I really hate, and I want to bring that hate over from here upon you so that at the end of the lecture you all hate it. That's the term objective. Objective reality is the most hateful, nonsensical thing in the world. You see, reality is something to be discovered. And of course you and your subjectivity are in it. It's your discovery. It's your love. It's not just given. Reality, that's what you begin to see and to discover, is loaded with meaning. In the past I made a little formula. Reality is fact plus meaning. That's what I said in the past. Reality is fact plus meaning. But I've unlearned to say so because I've begun to understand, and exactly my lecture is very much about that facts is a kind of scientific theory. Facts don't exist. Facts are scientific theories. It's a theoretical thing. So facts don't exist. So reality is never facts plus meaning, but reality is meaning. And fact is a theoretical thing, kind of reduction of reality, may be used in science. I have no objections to it, but we should never just think it is reality. Fact is not reality. My very, very personal scholarly definition of fact is that a fact is that we all agree upon. And nothing more. So if we all agreed that 2 and 2 is 4, then it's a fact. If there are some people who say, I disagree, it is not a fact, it is a supposition. That's the only difference. You see. So did Augustine die in 414 AD? Well, if that's what everybody is agreed upon, it's a fact. If somebody disagrees with my date, maybe it's a wrong date, then it's my supposition. Maybe totally wrong. It's just an idea I had. The second thing in relationship to this is we see what we know. We see what we know. You see, if I take all of you in a room for 5 minutes and then let you get out of that room again, and I'm going to investigate you and ask you, what have you seen? Then some of you might say, well, what I saw was the wallpaper. This person has gone to the cheapest shop and bought a very bad quality of wallpaper. Why do you know? Why have you seen it? Because you knew it. Because your father was a wallpaper seller and he always knew that this was the cheapest kind and not very good and so on. And you saw it immediately. Nobody else has even seen wallpaper because they don't know about it. But some of you, of course, that's why you're theologians, you immediately have run through to the stack of books and you have gone through it. And so you can say this person is of that and that theological school. I see it at the books. Because you know, because somebody who does not study theology could never tell even that it was maybe theological and certainly not which school. So you see what you know. That also means that you don't see what you don't know, you see. And so, for instance, Labrie in Holland has an orchard. And you see, if I walk through that orchard, I see trees. But if I walk with one of those people who coming from that region, and they walk through the orchard, they never see trees. These people see apple trees of this type and apple trees of that type. They know exactly, they see all these different kinds. I'm so stupid, I only see trees. They don't see trees, they see kinds. And when they walk there, they say, don't you see that there's a little bark like this? And I say, no, I don't see anything. And they say, oh, just come here. And they just turn around a leaf and say, there he is. Look at that, that's the little bark. And I don't see anything. Oh, don't you see that little red? And in the end you say, yes, I see it. You didn't see anything. You just say to peace. You see, we are blind because we don't know. You see, reality is that what you see because you know it. Now, our reality, so there is a creative way of seeing. With imagination, we try to see always more. That means enlarge the field of our vision. We try to see the structures of things in a way that is also what art is doing. Trying to get into the structure of things and show it. And in this sense, reality is infinite. We were talking about that this morning. Reality is infinite. There's always more to be discovered. With our imagination, we discover and we begin to see because we know. It's a very complex thing. Now, this belongs to that reality I was talking about, the reality of these people on vacation. Now think about, reality has completely changed. Totally changed. When the change occurred is different in different places and different time and different geographically and locally and in time. But somewhere between, let's say roughly 1700 and 1977, that's today, there has been a change. And the change that people today Americans were earlier than Europeans usually. Today we don't go on vacation every year to the same little hotel. No, we jump into our car and we drive 5,000 miles. And every year we go to a different place. And you ask yourself, what is the reason why we do so? And my theory is that we are just chasing reality. We want to grasp reality because we have not enough reality. So we think that if we drive quick and we see very much, that we really grasp reality. Of course, just because we have never time to get to know it, we will never really see it, and we will never get to love it. We just get through it. So sometimes we settle somewhere, and then something very strange happens. As soon as our eyes get open, as soon as we begin to know the land around us, we run away. 20th century people are afraid of getting in contact with reality. And I think this is a kind of paradox. We run to grasp reality, and as soon as we have the danger of grasping it, we run away. Because we don't want to grasp it. Because if we grasp it, we get in contact with reality, and getting in contact with reality means commitment. You begin to love it. You get ties to it. And we don't want to have ties, we don't want to have commitment. We want to have our freedom in an absolute way. So we run away. So we're chasing for something in order never to get it. That is something that is our modern ways. Now, why did these things happen? What is behind this change? It's emotional, it's intellectual. What did happen? Now, I think we got to go back in history. Something happened in history. There has been a great change, and the great change took place in the first place between 1300 and, roughly speaking, 1600. More than 3 centuries. The finalizing time was the 18th century. That's what we call the Enlightenment. And after that we go into modern reality, the modern world. So let's say, roughly speaking, after 1800. And then with different people, the final jump is made at a different time. Most people have jumped in the 60s. I think the 60s is the final revolution of what happened in the 18th century, what was based on happening on something that happened before. So if you understand what I'm saying, it means that we are in a big process which is totally overturning the world, overturning our reality, and that the change began somewhere around 1300 and that it finished in the 1960s. 1963 with the Beatles. That was the date that it was finalized. You see, it's a long change. So it took how many centuries? About 5 or 6 centuries. That is, I think, very quick. That is the time that great change, the pace great changes take to really work through. Just like when Christianity came in the world, it took about 4 to 5 centuries before Europe began to change. To tell you what has changed, and to make you feel it, I'll tell you some stories. The first story is the story of Mr. Santorio. Mr. Santorio wrote a book in 1614. In my Latin, it sounds like this: De Medicina Statica Aphorismis. I don't know how you pronounce that. It means that this man has been weighing, as a medical man, weighing, and that has been his scholarly, scientific job. And this book in 1614 is the final publication of his investigations. I just begin to tell you first what happened. When the book was published, it was reviewed, usually, as usually is done, and everybody said this man is crazy. Some said he's dangerous. Some said you got to bring him before the the Inquisition, and you got to put him in jail. Some people said you could rather put him into an insane asylum. Some other people said you can easily forget about it because it's too stupid even to think about that. You see, but everybody thought this man is totally crazy and stupid. And nobody, underline nobody, ever tried to control what he said. If I told you, see, it's very interesting, way up here in Massachusetts, if you go out, the sky is red. None of you is running outside to look whether the sky is red. Why don't you? Why don't you? Well, I know why you don't, because it's too stupid, you see. Why should you go outside? Because everybody knows the sky is not red in Massachusetts. So you remain in your seat. But suppose that I was right, that the sky was red. It would have been stupid to remain seated, isn't it? Well, this is actually what happened here in this book. People never try to do what he is saying. Now, let us talk about what he was doing. It's very interesting. What he did is he built a scale. You have a little platform, a big scale, and on the platform is a chair, and before the platform is a table. And now this is one of because the book is filled with all kinds of experiments like this, but this is one, and the most interesting one. He goes to somebody in the morning, wakes this person up, and that person, groggy from sleep, is put on the chair, which is on the scale, and then you give that person a breakfast. What is happening to the scale? What's happening to the scale? He gets heavier. Everybody agree? That's exactly what Mr. Santorio is saying. He gets heavier. Everybody in 1614 said that this is totally crazy. Everybody knows that if you get out of your bed, you're heavy with sleep, and then you get your breakfast and you get lighter. It's simply too stupid to think that you're heavier. But it does mean that you are all behind the change, on this side of the change. You see, in 1614, most people were on the other side of the change. Because we are all materialists, because we immediately think about atoms. And that's why we talk about way. They talked about psychological states. And I think there's a very good case to defend the man before 1614 that said that you get lighter after your breakfast. I think that's much more real than to say that you get heavier. It's against every experience that you get heavier. Who cares that you get heavier after all? You see, that you get lighter. That's why you drink coffee, don't you? And some people prefer some of that, these grape juice or whatsoever. Yeah, you see, that's why we get lighter. Well, this is a very interesting thing, and it proves that we are on this side of the change. More complex and even more fascinating is the story about the heart. In the old times, of course, people thought about the heart. And Galen, that is late antique period, Roman, he laid down in a book about human body what the heart really is, according to ancient thinking. Now, it's very difficult for me to explain. I don't know these things very well. It's very difficult for me to explain, and it takes too much time too, so I don't want to go into it. But very roughly speaking, it comes something like this. In the liver, there's a liquid produced, and that liquid is going to the heart. In the heart, that liquid is heated up, and life spirit is added to it. Now this heated up, full of life spirit blood, we're going to speak about blood now, is sent out to all the portions of our body. The heart is just sending it out. And you see, if you get excited, you begin to get red in your face. There's much blood in it. That means much life spirit, and your eyes begin to twinkle. Or you are very weak, you almost faint, you get white, life spirit is going out of your face and your body, and your heart beats very slow. It's a low moment. It just fits our experience. This was the old view that Galen was talking about. It's not stupid. Let's very much say it answers our experience of what the blood does and what the heart does. And the heart begins to beat. Now, there's one thing that I must mention, that in the theories of Galen, it comes down to this, that there is a hole between the left and the right side of the heart. Because the blood, and don't ask me to explain, but the blood has to go from one side of the heart to the other. Now, this is what's happening now. Now becomes the story, the exciting story. In 1306, in Bologna, in Italy, Professor Mondinus was the first man ever to do anatomy on a human body. So he began to cut open a human dead body. That's the beginning. It's part of what we call the Renaissance. That's, of course, the change we're talking about. And so soon we have books on the table describing what you see if you do this. And, of course, one of the first things they looked at was the heart. And it's very interesting, but they saw there was a hole between the left and the right side heart of the heart. So there is a hole. And not only Mondinus and his pupils and the pupils of his pupils saw a hole in the wall between the left and right side of the heart, but everybody saw a hole up to the greatest great man in anatomy, and that's 1550, and that's Vesalius. Vesalius, just around 1550, produced the final book on human anatomy. He is the greatest of all. Do you understand? 2.5 centuries of anatomical studies. Now, I'm told, I've never seen these things myself, but that in the heart wall there are many cavities. So it's very difficult to see. It's really not a simple wall, but it's very complex. But nevertheless, why did they all see a hole there when there wasn't a hole? Well, they saw a hole because you see what you know. And of course they saw it because that's what they knew that there was. There got to be a hole. And I think that secretly they were all afraid that there wasn't a hole. Because if there wasn't a hole, something very strange was going to happen. Vesalius is the first man ever said there is no hole. Now Vesalius was the court physician of the Spanish king, and he had very many high positions. He was deprived of all of them after the book was published because he saw no hole. There was something utterly wrong with him. You see, everybody said there's something crazy with him. There's something dangerous here. Let's put him away. You see. So, many things go into it. 1550, Vesalius. 1628, 70 years later, the final thing happens. You have William Harvey, professor in London, physician, who has discovered something, understood something rather, discovered, interpreted something, and he was induced by a friend, please write about it. And so he began to write about it. So reluctantly, underline again, reluctantly, in 1628 he wrote his book. And in that book, which I'm told is a very dry, not very interesting book to read. So he begins to talk about and so on and so on. And then on a certain passage he says this. Now do you understand, by God, what it means? It means this, that the heart is a pump. You see, he was talking about the blood circulation. He says, don't you understand? The heart is a pump. It's not my word, it's his word. But he says, by God. He was really shaken. In this dry book, he really gets excited. He says, don't you understand? It's a pump. And I think we got to get excited. Because it means this. If we have understood anything of the things that I've just been talking about the last minutes, you've understood this. The Lord Jesus said to us, you got to love the Lord your God with all your heart. After 1628, we're saying we're going to love the Lord with all our pump. Can we say that? Can we say that? Can you love the Lord with all your pump? Or what is it? Are the people before 1628 all stupid people? Or are they only using a symbol? Was Jesus talking about a symbol when he said you got to love the Lord your God with all your heart? Was that a symbol? A symbol for the center of life or something? Or was he really talking about this? You know that thing that makes noise, that goes sometimes quick, sometimes slow, your beating heart. What is he talking about? And I think this is the great problem. This is the real problem. And unless we solve that problem, we have lost the battle against everything that goes on in the world. Then we live also in a dead universe and man is dead. We are only very complex machines. So this problem is, of course, not a new problem. It is an old problem, but it's a new problem in a new formulation. It's a problem that modern theology goes in relationship to physics. And if we want to keep to the Bible, then we got to know this. Is man dead? Is he only a being with a pump, or has he a living heart loving the Lord? In order to understand some of these things, I want to make some long digressions. The first about Barfield. Barfield wrote a book on saving the appearances. He's an interesting man, friend of C.S. Lewis, and he talks in that book about participation. Participation is a word that you find in old philosophy books very much, for instance, Thomas of Aquinas. Now, to understand what that participation means, and I just follow Barfield very roughly, maybe best to understand if we look at the old paganism. You see, they can have idols, and idols are loaded with meaning. They are statues, but loaded with meaning. The God is in it, and you get all kinds of words as taboo and mana. In the third world, people got problems about this, and then you begin to understand what participation meant. A friend of mine who is a missionary said, I came to a little village somewhere in the west coast of Africa, and I found that these people had no water. And I said, you're stupid, because there is water in the ground. You just have to dig a well. And so he dug a well, and he says, there's your water. And nobody said thank you. Everybody said, what have you done? You opened the ground. You let loose the spirits of the ground. What is going to happen? You see, this is participation. Everything is loaded with spiritual powers. Evil powers, good powers. This is participation. It's very interesting that the Bible is exactly, totally opposite to this. There is no participation in the Bible. That is exactly the liberation. When Paul stood on Mars Hill, I'm sure that he said, opening his Bible, now look here, and he opened in the first place. Don't you see what it is what the Lord is telling us? He said, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and there is nothing in this world which is not created by God. And that means you are free to investigate everything because it does not participate in God. There is nothing that's godly. And Christian freedom is there, that the Christian is free, and modern science could never have been there. It is a fruit of Christianity because reality is free for investigation. It was never free for investigation in the pagan times because it was loaded with the gods. You are not going to touch the wrath in the hands of the gods. Something like this. It's very interesting that the Bible liberates people, and the Bible says things are not participated. Things are not godlike. That doesn't mean there is no meaning to it. They are loaded with meaning. In Psalm 19 we'll read of the mountains that speak, even without a tongue, of the greatness of God. They are loaded with meaning. If we think about the end of Job, and God is showing Job around, giving him a little tour on the universe, he said, Job, where were you when these and these and these things were created? He shows him the meaning of things, and he talks about these fantastic great things in this reality. So the Bible knows about the meaning of things, but it's not participation. So the Bible cannot have idols. And the Bible says, even the name of God, when God says, this is my name, he says, I am. He doesn't call himself the sun or the moon or something like this, nothing like this, because that would always imply participation. Something would become a symbol, but the symbol was standing for the thing and becoming the thing. No, God says, I am. That's all. No participation. There's nothing in this reality that can stand for God, because God is in nothing in this reality. Nevertheless, they are creatures of God, and God is interested in them, and they are loaded with meaning. This is the biblical message. So to say it in another way, the deist in the 18th century said, God created the world like a watch, and then he let it go. And I think this is just showing how trite and superficial people think. Because if you take that metaphor, I think this is the great miracle, that God created the universe as a big watch, but every little wheel in it is free. Now, if we do that, then of course the watch doesn't run 1 second. But here it runs, and there is no chaos. You see, so God makes things that are free, and yet there is no chaos. God is in it, He is interested in it, and yet there is no participation. Third, the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, of course, there is much of Christianity in the Middle Ages, but there is lots of the old paganism in the Middle Ages. And you see that in their thinking. For instance, they all believed in astrology. And astrology, of course, is tied up with participation. The gods are in the stars, and the movements of the stars are related to us. It's a vitalistic kind of thinking about the world. The Middle Ages are always thinking about the world in a qualitative sense. We always think in a quantitative sense. We make statistics. They never made statistics because we're not interested in the statistics, because you are interested in things what they are, not how many are there. You see, and so they talk about quantity. It's a substantial thinking. What is the meaning of this? What is its substance? In difference to our functional way of thinking, into which I'm going in a few moments. May I just go on in these very fascinating things? Because I think that there are in this room a few stupid people who think that the people in those days thought that the earth was flat. I don't know, this is one of the fascinating things, I still don't know, I want to find out one day, who was the first to tell this crazy story. Because nobody ever thought that the earth was flat. They didn't think so in the ancient period, they didn't think so in the Middle Ages, and of course later they didn't think so. Rather like this, the Middle Ages thought like this. Again, I'm quoting at this moment C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book on this, The Discarded Image. If you have never read that book, please read it. It's fascinating and very important. The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis. What he says is this, and he just shows how medieval men were thinking. In the universe, in the center of things is the earth, a ball. And around that ball are spheres, different spheres, and on each sphere you have a planet. And then you have one sphere with a light-giving planet, which is the sun, and then you have a few more, and then you have the final big sphere, and that's where the stars are fixed. Now this basically comes from Aristotle, who just thought the same. So you have the earth in the middle, and you have this expanding universe, but not in the sense that he used to this today. Now, Aristotle never dared to ask what is behind the last sphere. The Christians did dare to ask. They are free to ask questions, and so they ask the question, what's behind it? And the answer is very easy, it's God. God and the heavens are beyond the spheres. And therefore the Middle Ages made a second image, which you don't find with Aristotle, and that is in the center of God, everything is God. And around God you have different spheres, that is spheres of the angels. And the different heavens. And then you have the last sphere, it's far away from God. It's almost, you see, God is the most real of all real realities. And the further you go away from God, the lesser reality there is. Now, in the outer circle, the outer sphere, there were realities, almost non-reality. That is where we are. We are on the fringe of the universe. So you have a dual system, a system in which the earth is in the middle of it, that's a physical universe with these spheres around it, and that has its counterpart in another one in which God is in the middle, and then we are just on the fringe of the universe. These two systems, these two belong together, and they both together describe the world. It's very beautiful. If you talk about these things, for the medieval man, in his Bible interpretation, but also in his interpretation of things like this, he said you can look at things in the literal way, in a moral way, in an allegorical way, and in an anagogical way. That is the direction it takes. I'm not going to explain these things, and probably you know about this, but their literal was also what we call symbolic. There was no difference. That was the same. Because things are loaded with meaning, and the symbol is the meaning of things. So, they make no difference there. What they call literal is including what we call symbol. I can try to explain to you. What is the United States flag? And I would say the United States flag is very interesting. It's a United States flag. And I can never get around. The United States flag is not a piece of cotton with some symbols attached to it. The United States flag is a United States flag. It is a symbolic thing. You can never get them outside of each other. And I think we still can feel this. The United States flag is literally the United States flag, although the flagness of the flag is symbolic. You see, it's the same. And in this way, medieval man understood everything. We try to get the things out of each other. Now we come to the new worldview. So we have had the pagan worldview, the biblical, the medieval, and now we come to the modern one. It begins with this Mundinus who began to cut into a body. It's a new visibility, this new way of looking at things, out of which also Renaissance art is coming, because we must understand. And I'm just making big jumps, and I do it very quick. We have no time to go into it. But when Alberti and Masaccio and his friends were formulating Renaissance perspective, and therefore defining Renaissance space, this was something totally new that never had been in history before. And when Descartes says, in the beginning of the 17th century, that space is a res extensiva, it's the boundless, everywhere homogeneous matter. This is how he defines space, res extensiva, the homogeneous extensive matter. Then we must understand that that is very new. Before the Renaissance, the space was not homogeneous. So the new formulation, which is based also on geometry and mathematics, of the new way of understanding space in the Renaissance, went on through Descartes, and from Descartes on to Kant. So when Kant says that one of our categories is space, we must understand that he's saying something very special. He's saying that one of the categories of us is space, and that is the Renaissance definition of space as was defined by Alberti and a Renaissance artist. It's that space. It's Renaissance artistic space, not any other space. So it goes into history like that. It's a new visibility, with a new understanding of reality, with a new spatiality of reality, or spaciousness, or how you call that. Before we want to go on in this new worldview, I want to insert a thing, and it's more a call. Please, please, and work on this. Because I think it's going to help us to solve the problems we're talking about. And that is a reformation. Because, you see, I don't know how your books are. I have not gone into your books of philosophy, nor have I read your books of the history of theology. But usually, at least the books that I've read go like this. You have the great Thomas of Aquinas, I forget what's before that. You have the great Thomas of Aquinas, and you get William of Ockham, and then, yes, you have Nicolaus of Cues. And then you have, yes, one special crazy Italian, Giordano Bruno, and then you have nothing. This is a total empty time, and certainly none of the reformers had ever thought. They are not in the history of thinking. Until the new era begins, hooray, there he is, Descartes. You see, so there is a kind of gap between William of Ockham and Descartes, and nobody thought in that era. It's almost like this. Well, let's be honest, and very honest, it's not true, and it's very biased. It's biased looking out of a Cartesian way of thinking. Because in the Reformation time, people thought very, very much. And I'm so happy that last year, a book thick like this, and a fascinating book by a certain Mr. Webster was produced in England, and it's called The Great Instauration. And it teaches us how in the 16th and 17th centuries, people in the Reformation line were thinking, trying to find a solution of the very problems that I'm discussing at this moment. The discussion, how can we have the understanding of reality from a biblical point of view and at the same time incorporate the new things that we find in science. The science which was just coming out of the Reformation just because these people were totally in love with reality and they were fascinated by it. You see, this fascination went into discoveries of some things and how to incorporate the discoveries in what you already know. This is what Webster is discussing in the Great Instauration. And not very far from here, I think in Boston, there is a Professor Loemker, 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 who has discussed the same thing in a book, Struggle for Synthesis. He talks about the same problem. And you see that Christians in those days were very hard working, very active. They lost the battle. They lost the battle. We must say this, very definitive. We lost the battle. The losing is the Enlightenment. Why did it lose it? That's a difficult question, and I think we should pass it by, but I think it's important to analyze why they lost, because we can learn from their mistakes and maybe try to regain and win. So it is important to go into this. So it is just a plea, please study the philosophy and the thinking of the Reformation people. And there are at least 2 books to go by to help you starting in the philosophy that even Calvinistic philosophers have passed by, I must say, to their shame. What happens in the other line, the non-Reformation line, the Reformation line that was fighting against this, that is the secularization. The Reformation understood that Christ came in order to make us human. And then comes the new secularized world that says, yes, we want to be human, and forget about Christ. It's a secularization. And the great people are Locke and Descartes. It talks about the autonomy of man with his reason, and of course the autonomy of nature with its laws. The eternal laws. What is an eternal law? Very important. An eternal law is 2 and 2 is 4. Everybody in 1620, when these things were first written, said, ha, 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 you're totally crazy, Mr. Descartes. Don't you know that the Lord has said there's only one thing that's eternal, and that's His Word? What is 2 and 2 is 4? It's just, at best, a little fact. Today, we think very serious that these are eternal laws. And people always tell you, 2 and 2 is 4. Does it make any difference whether you're Christian, yes or no? You see, these are eternal laws. Forget about it, I would say. It's not eternal at all. The autonomy of man and the autonomous nature. It means, and I'm not going to give you many quotes that I have, but Locke is the man who wrote the final, very good popular book that was popularizing the things in the 18th century. He just wrote before 1700. It's an essay concerning human understanding. And basically what the book says is this. It's not true what Mr. Rookmaaker is saying, that you see what you know. It's quite the reverse. You know what you see. You know what you see. The only thing that you know is that what you can see. I would say, of course, it's still true what I'm saying. You see what you know, but you have narrowed down your knowledge to that what is seeable. Or in any other way, be taken in by the senses. So, you know what you see. And now everything becomes very much, this is the reduction. Of course, I'm describing the reductionist scheme. Participation is gone. Things are things are things are things. This is one of the greatest poems written in the last years in San Francisco. I've forgotten by which great genius wrote this poem. It's a very deep poem, and he says, a thing is a thing is a thing. And I think this is a very true statement. It's a final statement coming out of the Lockean way of thinking. That is what it is. And there is nothing else. It means totally no participation. We got to look at things objectively. That means get rid of your subjectivity, that what you know, and reduce yourself to what you see. Tonight we will go into that in the arts more precisely. Things become objective. Bacon already said that the business of understanding should be done as if by machinery. It's a functionalistic way of thinking. The third things are understood and studied by their functions, not by they are. And of course, all science and all thinking got to be neutral. No religion in it. No God. That's why our history books have become all falsifications, because what people have, were the driving force of their doings and their work is taken out of it. It is the total secularization. Of course, and we discussed it this morning very shortly, and I will do it again very short, pietism was in the same time. And the pietism is the escape of the Christian. He said, of course, you can have the world of reason. We are just jumping in the world of faith. And they left this world. I think that's one of the saddest moments in history, that Christians retreated, did not fight the battles. So, what is the Enlightenment? This is the change. Before the Enlightenment, before 1700, everybody, without exception, everybody, Christian or not Christian, thought the world to be like this. There is a supreme being, Christians call it God, and out of that supreme being comes this world. Christians call it creation. Comes out this world, and then you have the highest beings, angels and things like that, and then you get man, animals, plants, and the lowest kind of reality ever are things. There are almost no reality. You see, God is the most real of all real things, and stuff is almost nothing. It is the same as the spheres that I was just talking about. And in the time of the Enlightenment, and this is a new thing, they said, this is the only reality, this is what I can feel. This is the only reality, the stuff. The rest is just completely subjective additions. It's totally absurd, but it's there. How do the other things come? You see, you had stuff. Well, it's fascinating. If you read, in a couple of weeks ago in Time, there was a fascinating story how the stars are born and develop and die. It's a fascinating story, but it's atoms, complex atoms and atoms. And in that field is a fascinating story. But how do we get out of those atoms into something else? Well, in long stretches of history, this is what people have found, or think they have found. Life emerges, and out of life come plants, and out of plants come animals, and out of animals comes man, and man is certainly a kind of mistake of the evolution, because man is the craziest being of all. He discovers God. He makes God. It's his projection. You see, so God is, instead of being the most real reality, becomes the most vague human imagination. Less real than a common ghost. You've got to understand this is a total reversion of everything. And that's exactly what we're talking about. The total reversion of everything. Reality is this. So how do we know reality? Just the facts of it. Interesting, and I don't want to pass this by, is this beautiful, beautiful quote out of this very good book, if you want to read about this, by Peter Gay, the book on the Enlightenment. And in one of the Enlightenment and Interpretation by Peter Gay, the first book, this is the second book, the first is called The Enlightenment, the new paganism. And he says this, and he talks about Diderot, who is the great man of this revolution. Diderot's malaise, his sickness, went deeper, precisely at the moment when the time for amity seems to have come. The new philosophy threatened to render man's relation to nature problematic once again. 18th century thought had liberated man from his filial dependence on God and made him part of nature. But the philosophical anthropology of the philosophers, the thinkers, which promoted man from servitude, ironically enough, demoted him at the same time. From his position a little lower than the angels to a position among the intelligent animals. While man seemed at the point of conquering his worldly domain through his critical intelligence, he was faced with a second expulsion from his terrestrial paradise, and this time the avenging angel was man himself. It's a fascinating quote by somebody who is not a Christian, but I think he really understands. He really understands. So, After this, man is a rabbit. Man is an atom, and the whole world has become mechanized. Yes, man is the lord over the world. We are the boss. But C.S. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, yes, that's true. That means some people are the boss. That means the rest are really slaves of these some people. And that's actually what's happening. And of course, Lou has been writing about these things, and Susanna Langer has been writing about these things. Tonight I will give a quote from Susanna Langer. And it all comes down to this, that there is not a conflict between faith and science. There is not a conflict between faith and science. There is a conflict between faith and another faith. Between a Christian faith and a non-Christian faith. Between a world vision which is coming out of the Bible and many other things, and another world vision which is a reductionist view which comes out of modern science, which was the science from the 18th century Enlightenment. This is the conflict. Man remains man, of course, and he tries to fill the gap. So we get protests, and that's what art is doing. And people are talking about the irrational, and they try to fill it with mystique and Gnosticism. But whatever it is, the world is made by man. Tonight I will show you a slide of a etching by Max Klinger. It's a fascinating thing. Made around 1890. And the artist shows us the philosopher. He calls it like this. And you see a man looking at the world. And you see, so from that side, you look at him, you see him looking at the world. There's a beautiful landscape. And very soon that man finds out that he's looking at himself. He's looking at himself. It's fascinating to understand. You see, if you say the sun sets, the scientist sits beside you and says, man, you're old-fashioned, crazy. The sun sets. The sun doesn't set. The sun is still there, and we're just turning around, and there's some kind of breaking effects of light, and that's all. Forget about it. Nothing special. So if you say it's a beautiful sunset, everything you say is your invention. There's nothing out there. There's certainly nothing beautiful. The beautiful is yours. So that means that if I'm saying there's a beautiful sunset, what I'm saying is I have invented a beautiful sunset. That means I'm looking at myself. At my own invention. There's nothing out there. And this is one of the results of this way of thinking. We make the world. We make the norms. We make everything. And the world is one big machine, objective, but we add to it. And if the world is wrong, of course, we got to change this. And there you have the Marxism and all the things of today. We're going to change it. And the structuralism, which is so strong in America, of course, is based on these things. The reality is our model. And the revolution is that we just have to change. You see, so women in all ages have been misused by men, and women always have been inferior. We just change it overnight, and now women are the bosses of the world, and they're much better than men. Okay, wonderful. You see, because it's just our making. You see, in the past, man made the world, now women are going to make the world. You see, that's all the difference. But it isn't like that. We've got to ask questions, what is the real world? Because the world is not our making. It's not that simple. That doesn't mean that there not was something wrong maybe in the past. And of course we got to fight evil. I think that's our task. Something else. Now the role of science is very important in all this, because science is the revelation. Don't run too far. I'm very near the end. Very near the end. The role of science is that it is a revelation of man, of humanistic man, who doesn't accept revelation. So science for him is going to tell what reality is. And it got to explain to him the utopia of the new world to come. So science has two functions, the world now and the world that we're going to make with the help of science. So that it is. But whatever you think and whatever you discuss, one thing is very, very clear. There is no conflict between science and faith. It is a conflict between between faith and faith. The two ways of looking at the world, different ways of understanding the world. different worldviews. A worldview that comes out of the Bible and a worldview that comes out of modern science in the ways of the Enlightenment, the Cartesian line. So we must understand that it's very interesting. 2 years ago, I was in a group, in a circle of my very best friends. And they were all very fine Christians. And we all trust each other. And then I said this, in this circle. I said, don't you understand that if you accept the principles and methods of modern science, that the Bible is not true? 5 minutes later, one of my friends said, but you said that the Bible wasn't true. You see, this is the trap. And that is the trap that I want to warn you against, because it isn't true. When I'm saying, if you accept the principles and methods of modern science, and that are the ones that I've just been discussing, if you accept the principles and methods of modern science, the Bible is not true. That means that because for me the Bible is true from beginning to end, I have very many questions about the principles and methods of modern science. And I think that is the thoughts that we really have to develop if we want to win. Because otherwise we cannot but lose, because inevitably modern science, being very strong, having this reality, undeniable reality, it's hard, you get with your head against this reality, is going to win. So please, ruin that. It's not the results of modern science that we have plastics and these electric equipments. These are results. But the methods and principles of modern science, this reductionist view, this thinking that only the things that you can see and weigh and measure are real. That's why in this world, Bultmann says, in this world of aeroplanes and vacuum cleaners and radios, the Bible's miracles are not true. It is just throwing away your brains. It's a sacrificium intellectuum. It is a sacrifice of your intellect. And I'm saying, I'm sorry, Mr. Bultmann, it's a sacrifice of your intellect if you don't understand that if you reduce, and you are so happy, you stand in awe for aeroplanes and vacuum cleaners and radios, and you think that the world is reduced to these things, and there is nothing more. I have no problems with Christ walking on the waters. I think that it is stupid not to believe in this. But these things are not just something theoretical. They have results in the emotional life that people have. The world is not interesting to them. They talk about alienation. Things are objective. All my students always come to me and say, we want to have objective facts. And I tell them, sorry, you'll never get it. Because they don't exist. And if I could give them to you, they were not interesting. Because objective facts are those facts are how the things are if man isn't there. But who cares how the world is when man isn't there? That's not interesting. It's alienation. Out of these things come also the new permissiveness. There are no norms. The world is made by us. So we declare things. So we make the woman to this, and we make the woman to that. We make the structures like this, and we make the structures like that. And maybe the only real thing is our natural instincts, our sexual drives, and so on. Another result of this is the very uncertainty, the loss of identity. Always in library people say, who are we? Of course, if you are only a bunch of atoms, who are you? And Sartre's answer was very clearly, that's absurd. You shouldn't be there even if you are there. You see, that is what people are still fighting about. I think the women lib has all this identity crisis in it. Bob Dylan, about a decade ago, talked about this with a term he called the thin man. He said he has a thin man ballad. He talks about this absurd man. He's very thin. And I think that we are, not they are, we are included. A thin man. We are thin, and our reality is thin. We have lost it. It has become transparent. It has become very vague. That's why some people can take drugs. We don't happily, mostly, usually. But thin man in a thin reality. So we come to our final conclusions. No, wait a minute, there's one thing more to be said. It's very interesting that the same Barfield said, just because of this, we have all the difficulties in politics, because there is no unity anymore in the nation. And there's no unity anymore because there's no hierarchy. You see, we want to have equality. Maybe in Europe we speak louder about equality than in America. But Barfield says, and it's a difficult sentence, I will read it twice, that we are all equal precisely in the regard that we are independent, alienated, and isolated from each other. You see, we are equal precisely in the regard that we are independent, alienated, and isolated. Because if we are not independent, alienated, and isolated, it means that we have ties together. It means that one becomes more important, or is at least of different importance than the other. Then we are not equal anymore, but we are all different. We are only equal insofar as we alienated and isolated. And that's why you can never build up any politics on that basis. Very interesting. I have here a book which goes into many of these things. It's called The Discontinuous Universe. A very interesting book. The Discontinuous Universe. And it has many chapters written by the greatest thinkers of our era, and it says that structuring, providing abstract models which bear some coherent relationship to the external world, continues to be the basic activity of the human mind. Because there is only uncertainty, and it talks about this desperate quest of modern man, but I'm passing it by. I want to come to my conclusions. So what is the problem today, as I see it? And the problem is that we got to get fat again out of our thinness. And we got to get fat again to rediscover reality. And I really mean it when I say to rediscover reality. We have lost the knowledge of reality. And when I talk about reality, I also mean suffering, sin, the curse. One of the most interesting and to my thinking, very crazy things that I found is that theologians have written many books on the grace of God. How many books have they written on the curse of God? We barely know what the curse means. Nobody has really thought about it. Nevertheless, if we don't know what the curse is, how can we know what reality is? How can we know whether a natural law really can be counted on? If we don't know whether this reality can be counted upon, because we don't know what the curse means. I think we really got to think more about what the curse means, and of course suffering and sin in that relationship. If we want to rediscover reality, I think to be Christian means to go into reality. The Bible doesn't give only propositional facts. Of course, the Bible from beginning to end is telling things how they are. It tells us about history, but it's not just history. I'm always saying, you see, there were naked women who are eating apples. Now, there's nothing special in this world history. There have been 10 million women, naked women, who have been eating apples. The last time it happened this summer in a nudist camp here in Massachusetts, that a woman was eating an apple for the tree, a nude woman. Nothing special. But only once in history it was so important that it's recorded in the Bible. And we call that the fall, because the eating was not just eating, it was loaded with meaning. And to understand that meaning is something that is more than just a fact. The fact is not interesting. The meaning of it is interesting. But you can never have the meaning without the fact. We got to talk about these things and think about them. We can never have the meaning without the fact. This is a terminology I don't like to use, but it is something important to think. So the Bible, to me, is not only giving so-called facts, but the Bible is also telling us how to think about reality. It's giving not a world view of the past, but it tells us this is the way to look at the world. And it includes a mentality, a way to stand, and a kind of insight. It's not an old-fashioned worldview. It is something that is very up-to-date. If we don't grasp this, we will never get back to real reality. Polanyi who has battled against neo-positivism, has written a book about personal knowledge. I think he is co-belligerent. I think that there's very deep insight. He says that it is personal knowledge. All our knowledge is personal, colored by our own past and personality. Nevertheless, it can be true. It's not subjective. It is beyond the subjective and the objective. And these things are very difficult, but we got to think them through. There's an old question, what is truth? It's not the eternal truth of Descartes. Truth is, Christ said, I'm the truth and the life and the way. What is truth? Truth is certainly related to reality and life and beauty and justice and righteousness and love and freedom. These are different things and yet they are related. How? Well, this is something we got to think about more. Truth and reality and life and beauty. So I come to my final conclusions, or rather my final question. Do you understand what it means when I say you got to love the Lord your God with all your heart? What does it mean when I say you got to love the Lord your God with all your heart? Can we really say that as 20th century people now in 1976 without sacrificing our intellect? What do we say? And I'm saying we can only be sound Christians that can look every modernist in the face. If we have the answer to this question, I can say, yes, I love the Lord, my God, with all my heart. And that heart includes the pump of Mr. Harvey. But it's not only the pump of Mr. Harvey. It's more than that. I must say I don't understand. I have not an answer. I have not the answer. Nevertheless, I think this is for your generation, for you and your children to think about, so that in 250 years from now, at this place, there may be somebody standing and he says, I know a little bit. I can tell you, isn't it fascinating? And maybe he has a little bit of an answer. May I end with another metaphor? I've asked that question many, many years ago. I'm doing it again. What is water? Well, water is the beauty of the waterfall. It's the drink given to the thirsty. Christ even gives us an entrance to heaven for that. It is the bad-smelling little canal that you have in Holland. It is the roaring seas. It is the rain in your face. It is the nice little water in the swimming pool. We can go on for hours what water is, and we can ask many, many poets, and they have written and they will go on writing about this fascinating, most fascinating of all fascinating topics, water, one of the basic elements of creation. Or is it, and then we say it with modern science, H2O? That's the question. Thank you.
So there you have it. Your first full-length introduction to Hans Rookmaaker's ideas in his lecture, What is Reality? And you should listen to that more than once. Like I say, the reason I could listen to his lecture over and over and over is because this thing is dense, a lot denser than you understand. If you think you got it the first time through, all I can say is either A, you're a genius, or B, you're kidding yourself. You think a lot more highly of your skills than you ought to. And so I would recommend going back and listening to it a few times. Well, have you subscribed to the channel yet? Have you give this video a like? Have you, you can, of course, donate through PayPal. And people who donate through PayPal will get special little things. And particularly if you donate $10 or more a month, or a one-time gift of $50 or more. But it doesn't matter if you give or not. I'm just glad to have you. And remember, anadromous is a word describing salmon swimming up a river against the stream to go home. And you should be swimming against the streams of so much that is crass and ridiculous in our society today. and you should also be swimming up the stream away from the false realities towards the true reality. From Tbilisi, this is Byrne. We will meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.